story about the delousing?
Well, I only find out the real story now. I did not know this for the longest time, but we were all put into what looked like a great big bathroom, I guess, because they had these shower things at the top, and we were put onto benches. We were all stark naked, old and young. Of course, the sexes were separated, but we all had to sit in a row. And then somehow, and I don't know how it happened, but somehow the rumor started that they were going to gas us. I have to tell you that this is really true. This is what happened. And what happened eventually is that they rained from the shower heads. They rained soap and water on us. And the reason for that was that we had to be deloused. We were so full of lice through that. Our hair was cut. And they rained soap and water on us. I do not remember if there were any towels, but we came out, and this happened prior. You see, we had to be clean to be naturalized. Yes. So this happened prior to that.
Otherwise.
That's right.
Germans had to be clean in
That's
those
right.
days.
And I remember how embarrassed these people were to sit there stark naked. So when I hear about the shower heads and the Holocaust and all of that, I know exactly what it was. That was soap and water raining down on us to delouse us. That's what it was. And where the story came from, that those were dangerous shower heads, I don't know. That must have come out of the Russian propaganda in those years, because I remember it very clearly, that there was a rumor,
In other words,
we were going to be done in.
These simple people were afraid of this procedure?
We were afraid of this procedure, yeah. And if I can tell, you can cut it out if it doesn't
so it's
belong.
like Steven Spielberg, that everybody in Schindler's List is waiting for the gas to come in.
And all it
lo and
is
behold, all it was
soap and water
was
came
water.
raining down on us in this great big, we called it banya, which is a Russian word for a washroom. Bathroom, yeah, but it was a big one, a communal bathroom. It was huge, I would say. It was, the way I remember it, of course I was little, but the way I remember it, I would say it was at least 30 by 30. It must have been built for that purpose, to wash us down like dogs.
But most people, of course, don't know is that the Germans had drawn a line from the Baltic, or actually from the North Cape virtually all the way down to the Bosporus, and anybody that came across that line, whether he was German or Mennonite, Jews for that matter, anybody in Europe could not go across that line without being deloused, because they wanted to keep lice out of Europe, because lice were so dangerous to public health.
That's right. So that was
don't
the
feel
first...
badly, you were not picked on because we were Mennonites or Lutherans.
Or the same for the cutting of hair. I mean, we were all shorn bald in order to stop the louse problem that we had. Everybody had lice in the war, you know. I mean, this was just common knowledge that everybody had lice, and then of course we had to be deloused and put into Germany.
So Jews cannot claim unique victim status?
No, they cannot. And when I hear the stories about them losing their hair, big deal. None of us had hair. Yeah. So that was my take on it.
And how about the cattle cars?
Well, the cattle cars was pretty much the same story, because we considered ourselves lucky if we could ride in a cattle car, of course, because then we did not depend on horses. We did not have to walk on foot. Man, that was luxury, to ride a cattle car. And yes, they were crammed full of people, and yes, it was very difficult, you know, to travel like that. Often you could not sit. You had to stand because they were crammed full. Often there was not water. There was no food. This is how it was in those years. People were hanging on those cattle cars. When you see those pictures, that could have been us. We were like that in those years. That means nothing. The same when you see the bunk beds. My goodness, we were lucky if we had bunk beds where we could sleep at night. It meant we did not have to sleep outside in the snow. No. Those pictures mean nothing. To delouse us, that's what it was. And where the story came from, that those were dangerous shower heads, I don't know. That must have come out of the Russian propaganda.
20th century typhus was an endemic in Poland and several neighboring countries prior to World War I. During and shortly after the war, endemic typhus caused up to 3 million deaths in Russia, and several million citizens also died in Poland and Romania since 1914. Many troops, prisoners, even doctors were infected, and at least 150,000 died from typhus in Serbia, 50,000 of whom were prisoners. delousing stations were established for troops on the Western Front, but the disease ravaged the armies of the Eastern Front. Fatalities were generally between 10 and 40% of those infected, and the disease was a major cause of the deaths for those nursing the sick. During World War I and the Russian Civil War between White and Red, the typhus epidemic caused 2 to 3 million deaths out of the 20 to 30 million cases in Russia between 1918 and 1922.
Typhus caused hundreds of thousands of deaths during World War II. It struck the German army during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia in 1941, and in 1942 and 1943, typhus hit French North Africa, Egypt, and Iran particularly hard. We know that typhus killed inmates in the Nazi concentration camps and in quote-unquote death camps, such as Auschwitz, Dachau, and several others. Footage shot at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp shows the mass graves for typhus victims. We also know for a fact that Anne Frank, at age 15, and her sister Margaret both died of typhus in the camps. Even larger epidemics in the post-war chaos of Europe were averted only by the widespread use of the newly discovered DDT to kill lice on the millions of refugees and displaced persons.
Zyklon B is a hydrogen cyanide-based chemical compound initially created as a pesticide and rodenticide in the early 1920s in Germany. After the start of World War II, this compound was used to disinfect soldiers' barracks and the barracks at concentration camps to eliminate disease-carrying pests. It was also used to disinfect clothing and manage pests on ships and in factories.
In 1922, a team of chemists, which included Walter Ernst and Bruno Teschk, devised a method of packaging hydrogen cyanide in sealed canisters along with cautionary eye irritants. The newly created product became known as Zyklon B, uses including delousing clothing and fumigating ships, warehouses, and trains.
Prior to World War II, Degas derived most of its Zyklon B profits from overseas sales, particularly the United States. The United States Public Health Service used Zyklon B to fumigate freight trains and clothes of Mexican immigrants entering the United States. Uses in Germany included delousing clothing, often using a portable sealed chamber invented by Degas in the 1930s, and fumigated ships, warehouses, and trains. By 1943, a sale of Zyklon B accounted for 65% of Degas' sales revenue and 75% of its gross profit.
The Zyklon B canisters were originally designed as a pesticide to combat pests and diseases like typhus, which had caused severe outbreaks in the past. To prevent the spread of typhus disease, soldiers, prisoners, and buildings, and in many other countries, used Zyklon to disinfect clothing. For example, America used Zyklon B to disinfect Mexican immigrants. Delousing and disinfection checkpoints were even established for immigrants and migrants entering other countries. Within Camp 1 of Auschwitz, you had the registration building where the prisoners were tattooed upon arrival and had their hair cut and body hair shaven off. This would be the typical procedure to get rid of lice.
Even in the concentration camp Birkenwald, we have evidence that this is the typical procedure. For instance, in this building that you see here, newly arrived inmates and their clothing were disinfected. Every transport train could bring typhus or dysentery into Birkenwald. As a result, every new arrival had to go through the disinfection building. It was designed to process a capacity of 35 to 50 people at once. Exhausted from days of riding in a train or marching, starving, thirsty, and sick inmates were forced to undergo this procedure. They had to remove their clothes and hand over all their remaining possessions. The hair on their bodies and heads was shaved off, and they were dipped in a stinging disinfectant. After passing through this gauntlet, they had to walk naked through an underground passage, and many Jews delivered from Auschwitz feared for their lives upon entering the flat building, since in Auschwitz, entering a delousing station meant certain death in the gas chambers. However, there were no gas chambers used for murdering people at Birkenwald. The disinfection rooms were merely used to disinfect clothing. These sort of disinfection buildings were the real gas chambers.
In one of Heinrich Himmler's letters to Gestapo chief Ernst Kaltenbrunner, we have evidence that even in Auschwitz, the reason they initially built crematorias is because of the number of people who succumbed to disease, and the crematorias were only made to burn the bodies to prevent other diseases from spreading. To put an end to the epidemics, we were forced to burn the bodies in incalculable numbers of people who were destroyed by the disease. So we were forced to build crematoria, and on this account, they are loosing a bond for us.
The widespread of typhus was the main reason Zyklon B was made. Europe's Eastern Front experienced mass loss because of the pandemics caused by louse. So to claim that Zyklon B canisters and or residue on the walls are sufficient evidence to conclude that it was used to gas prisoners is null and void. Zyklon B canisters were used as a disinfectant. That's why it was made in the first place. Some may try to argue that the Nazis disguised the chambers as rooms for delousing in order to mislead people, but as we will demonstrate later, this claim also includes many holes. The crematoriums, as we have shown, were used to cremate the bodies of inmates that had died of disease.
Here's Camp 1 of Auschwitz. This is an aerial photograph in 1944. An inmate's first encounter with Auschwitz was the prisoners' reception center, near the gate with the Labor Make You Free sign, where they would get tattooed, shaved, disinfected, and given a striped prison uniform. The center contained a bathhouse, a laundry room, and 19 gas chambers for delousing clothing. As mentioned before, these were the real gas chambers, but instead of killing victims, it was used to combat harmful diseases and to prevent them from spreading in the camp. The reason inmates had their hair cut is because of the lethal typhus outbreak mentioned earlier that spread by lice. After this process, the prisoners would then enter the main camp, and even here the healthcare never stopped. In the main camp, there were 6 infirmaries, which are like small hospitals or first aid rooms that you would find in a school, prison, or any institution alike. These infirmaries included the block of internal diseases. You also had the surgical section and the block of medical experiment, the block for infectious diseases and tuberculosis, and another block for dysentery and internal diseases, the block of external consultations where prisoners could seek opinions for treatment or information from healthcare professionals. All these healthcare facilities surrounded a particular exhibit. We're to believe people were lined up and shot in masses. This would happen non-stop, and yet none of the several aerial photographs that we have contain such scenes, even though they were taken while said things were supposed to be going on daily without an end. This exhibit is now formally known as the Wall of Death, yet even here, the bricks that are the original bricks while these things were occurring lack any holes or cracks from any sort of shelling from gunfire. The site is not only surrounded by healthcare facilities, but is also accompanied by benches where prisoners could lounge at, while their peers are allegedly being brutally shot. We also have a pool located right around here, which is quite close to the previous mentioned exhibit. However, the swimming pool at Auschwitz I was built by the Nazis. It was not there before the camp, and it was constructed during the operation of the camp. So we're led to believe that the Nazis building an extermination camp, the first thing that they had on their mind to build in their extermination camp is endless healthcare facilities and a pool with a diving board.
Earlier, I mentioned how the claims about what happened at Auschwitz had many holes in the narrative. When we look at the delousing room, we can see that it has a wooden door. The type of door a room has reflects what is going on inside the room. For example, metal doors or gates tend to symbolize sturdiness in a fortified structure. You don't want anything getting in, or in some cases, getting out. We are told that mass executions were going on non-stop at this execution mall, yet we have zero aerial photo evidence of any of these events occurring. We even have photos of the United States bombing Auschwitz, and there is absolutely zero photo evidence of these executions occurring. If these executions were occurring non-stop at this execution mall, we would expect to have at least some aerial photo evidence. We have none. We are told that masses of people were executed at this execution wall. The supposed execution wall where these quote-unquote mass murders were occurring, yet there is zero evidence of holes or cracks from any kind of shelling anywhere in the brick. Not only that, but just a few feet away from this execution wall, there is a pool. Why would there be a pool right next to an execution wall? We are told that the holes right above the chambers are where they would release the Zyklon B, but we know that these holes were not original and were created later when the Soviets came in and modified it. This is admitted by one of the supervisors at Auschwitz while David Coleman was questioning her.
Most likely it would not be in the middle of the inmates' barracks, but would be further out where the SS men do not have to mingle with the inmates or swim while the inmates are staring at them with hatred and envy and loathing.
Wasn't there a rule that SS men only could enter the camp itself on official business?
Yeah. The inmates were allowed pretty much free reign around here. And because it's right in the middle of their barracks, it is very hard to believe that it was only for certain preferred inmates. Carlos Porter has published pictures of inmates sitting in front of the pool with the ladder in the back, the larger ladder, yeah. And they look quite happy. They're wearing their swimming trunks, and many people don't believe that there would be a pool here. But it is also interesting to note that only 3 barracks down is the back of the Wall of Death, the wall where supposedly 20,000 people or more were shot up against. But this is clearly an area for the inmates' enjoyment. You have benches lining this area. They can rest here. They can recuperate. The hospital is one barrack up that way. If they were ill, if they were recuperating, they can sit here. They can swim in the pool. And to have constant, not only shooting, but of course the impassioned cries of men about to be killed or as they're dying would really not mix with the way this place appears to have been built. The Wall of Death would have been more suited on the outskirts of this camp, because also it is no good for the inmates' morale if they are living right among the wall where they are being shot one after the other. Another important thing to note when you look at this pool, as you can see in the distance, there are 3 starting blocks, which look like they might have been used for swimming races, contests. This is not just a hole hastily dug. You can see there is a very nice fixture that perhaps at one time water came out of the mouth of that like a spout. There is a higher diving board, and then we have blocks, starting blocks here. Very clearly this was, one can imagine the inmates having races, one can imagine people being able to come here and relax after working, but it doesn't really mix with the concept of this as a death machine, this camp being a place where people come in and they die and they know they're going to die. Whenever you're taking a tour through Auschwitz, you have to be very careful to not be fooled by things that have been added since. Now, we have very good aerial photographs of Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau during the war, but we can only blow them up just so much, and there are little bits and pieces that might very well have been added.
In your experience, you saw this on the aerial photo?
Oh yeah, the swimming pool is definitely here. It shows that there was, that this was not just some kind of trapping to fool the world to believe that Auschwitz was humane when in reality people were dying here.
Good. And so now what we'll do is go down to the Wall of Death, have a look at that.
Sure, definitely.
So David, explain to us, what are we seeing here?
Well, this is the other side of the Wall of Death. You can see that there are no bullet marks in it. There are drawings that prisoners have made of the Wall of Death. There are no pictures, of course, and that's a kind of an interesting thing because we know that there are pictures taken other places where the Nazis had executed people. And yet, with 20,000 executions going on at the Wall of Death, you think that there would be just 1 or 2 pictures. It's something that the Nazis did not seem to mind recording what did happen, and of course we've never found any pictures or recordings of gas chambers, and now this has become very much of a shrine. The groups who come here are sometimes Jewish, sometimes Catholic, and they leave their mark depending upon what kind of religious symbols they are into. We have seen in the past couple of days a lot of Israeli flags planted on this wall, which don't seem to be around right now. I suppose they have somebody who clears away the dead flowers and brings, just makes it presentable.
So David, now we are outside the infamous Auschwitz I gas chamber. That's where the whole story began, really. Here we are looking at the gallows where Rudolf Hess was strangled, right?
In full view of his crime.
Yeah. That's what it says here.
So the burden of proof now falls on whether this was a crime or not.
And whether it was, in fact, if the crime was committed, whether it was committed in here or not. Now, the building in the background that we are seeing here is the SS hospital, or what?
Yeah, what's interesting, the 3 buildings on the end of the camp here are all for the SS. The furthest building was for Hearst. The odd thing is the building in the closest proximity, that gray building over there, the top floor was the SS hospital, and the bottom floor was the SS canteen, where they ate. As you can see, the windows of the hospital are directly across the road from the ventilation chimneys of the supposed gas chamber. Certainly poor planning on the part of the Nazis, who would be jeopardizing the lives of their own men, not of inmates, but of their own men. It's impossible to think that they would construct something so badly. One would have to say that the Germans had no sense of safety or engineering or anything like this, and we know that they do, and we know that they would not have built something in proximity to the gas chamber like that.
Now, this is the entrance, the one that with the natural flagstones we see here. That's the entrance, the alleged entrance.
Well, now, they claim now that the entrance was on the other side. They claim that this entrance, both our tour guide, the tour guide supervisor, and Dr. Piper claim that this entrance here is a complete reconstruction. It has been reconstructed for tourists, and it is where the tourists are taken in. But they now claim that the entrance for the victims to be gassed is on the other side of this building. We will shortly go over there.
And there were also these things that we see on the top here. What are these things?
Well, the two larger chimneys were chimneys on the roof were most likely either they are reconstructions from the original or they are the original, with the little metal roof there. Typhus epidemic, which resulted in many deaths. Then there's the artwork and the pictures of children. But at this point, it's looking pretty bad for somebody looking for objective proofs of the gas chamber. And some of the proofs they present actually work against the concept. For example, they have one of several aerial photographs taken of Auschwitz by the Allies during the war. They don't mention, however, that when blown up, these photos don't show people being gassed or bodies being burned, even though they were taken during the time killings were said to be going on almost non-stop. I won't even go into the special money the Germans printed for Auschwitz inmates, or the fact that even though it is said that Jewish children were killed immediately, both Anne Frank and her sister were sent to Auschwitz and survived, later being transferred to the Bergen-Belsen camp, where they are said to have died from typhus. But all this bickering would be pointless if we could see a genuine gas chamber for ourselves. That, of course, would most effectively end the argument. Which brings us to the building I'm standing in front of, the gas chamber and crematorium. Pictures of this building have been featured in book after book on the Holocaust. After all, what better proof it all happened? Revisionists don't dispute that this is a real building from during the war. We say that it was indeed a crematorium and a mortuary, which also was used as an air raid shelter for the SS men in the hospital and restaurant right across the street from it. The Auschwitz people say it was indeed a mortuary and a crematorium, with the mortuary part, which you're looking at right there, later being used as the gas chamber. They also say that it was used as an air raid shelter. And they have, in the past, admitted that the large brick chimney at the side of the building is a reconstruction, which is no big shock to anybody because it clearly isn't connected to the building in any way. Now let's go inside. Once inside, we can see why revisionists have had such a field day with this building. Obvious marks on the walls and floors, where apparently walls had been knocked down. Equally obvious holes in the floor where bathroom facilities had been. We maintain that, unlike the large hollow chamber we now see, this room had once been 5 rooms, including a bathroom. I should add that there is no Zyklon B blue staining in the walls, as there would have been with repeated Zyklon B use, and as there were and still are in the disinfestation chambers. A flimsy wooden door with a big glass pane in it, and a doorway with no door and no fittings for a door leading to the crematorium ovens. And I should also mention the big manhole right in the middle of the gas chamber. Yet the building does have what appears to be evidence of criminal usage. 4 holes in the ceiling, which lead to the roof, where 4 little chimneys stand. It is said that through these 4 holes, Zyklon B crystals were dropped. And indeed, there seems to be no other explanation for them. Do these holes prove homicidal gassing? Revisionists have claimed in the past that these holes were added after the camp's liberation, and that the inside walls were knocked down and the bathroom facilities removed to make the room look like a big gas chamber. As Alicia and I approached the building, we passed the gallows where the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, was hanged by the Soviets in 1947, executed directly in front of the evidence of his crime. Here, in front of the gas chamber, I ask Alicia about the authenticity of that building. Now let's start again talking about this building here. This
crematorium gas chamber.
But this is a reconstruction.
It is in original state. Original state.
Now there, Alicia has very clearly represented the gas chamber as being in its original state. Once inside, I asked her specifically about the 4 holes in the ceiling. Are those the original holes in the ceiling?
It is in original part. Original.
It is original.
Original for this chimney was from Cyclone B.
I then asked Alicia if any walls had ever been knocked down in the room exhibited as the gas chamber. So, this part was on the gas chamber.
Mm-hmm.
Were there walls here at one time?
But here, it was only one room. Only one room. That here I know here. When here I show picture of gas chamber, it was only one room here. No.
Let's pause here to recap the gas chamber according to our tour guide. She states that the room is in its original state, that the ceiling holes are original, and that no walls were knocked down. Unsatisfied with her answers, I continued to badger poor Alicia about the real history of this room, feeling somewhat exasperated at the fact that nothing she could say would shut me up. Alicia went to get a woman who was introduced to me as the supervisor of tour guides for the Auschwitz State Museum. When I saw this woman approach, I figured I was either going to get a straight answer or kicked out of the camp.
This is what I can suggest. It will be much better to go to our scientists in the State Museum and to talk. They show you a lot of plans which we still have in the archives.
Where would that be?
I don't think that it's open today, but probably in Monday it will be possible.
That's the Auschwitz State Museum?
Yes.
Is that in Oswiecim?
Here, in block number
in
24 and 23, I'm not sure about
Would
it.
it be possible for me to make an appointment to see him on Monday, perhaps?
That's true.
So it was here that it was first suggested I meet with the head of archives and senior curator, Dr. Franciszek Pieper. Still, fearing that such a meeting might not come about, and assuming that the supervisor was probably in the loop regarding any reconstructions, I decided to get her input regarding the supposedly original holes in the ceiling. Are those the original holes in the ceiling?
No.
They've been rebuilt?
Yes.
Okay. After the war?
After the
The 6 million count had been exaggerated by the Allies and Soviets. Although the Nazis had well-documented operations, they did not register the names of the Jews who were murdered in the extermination camps. In other words, it's important to note that we have millions of nameless victims. Which brings up my next point: why so few certified deaths? An analysis of Auschwitz certified death records show that most registered prisoners who had died were Roman Catholic, about 47%, and Jewish, about 43%. Smaller numbers belong to Greek Orthodox, Evangelical Lutheran, and Greek Catholic denominations. A small percentage had no religion listed. 2 official death registers survive, one from 1942 and another from early 1943, which is in better condition. These 2 official death records that survive contain around 900 individual death certificates, including names and personal details. These numbers are quite small to the largely pushed 6 million number. And these documented numbers come from the death books of Auschwitz. These books were official SS documents recording deaths in Auschwitz. In other words, we're told that over 1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz alone. But here's the thing. The actual official records, like the death books, only account for a tiny fraction of that number. Just tens of thousands, in fact. And those people, however, are named, registered, documented. We know when they died, and sometimes even how. In other words, we know they existed. We know they were in the camp because they were registered, and we know that they died because we have their death certificate. But the vast majority, supposedly over 1 million people, were never registered. They are nameless. They were never issued death certificates. There are no graves, no bodies. Which means, since they were not registered, we have no proof that they're even in the camp in the first place. And it also concludes that these people were nameless. And since they were never issued death certificate, it means we can't even prove they died there. What's even worse is that we're told that all the bodies were cremated. We are told the reason why they vanished is because they were all cremated. But this only raises more problems. Since we don't have the bodies, we must have the ashes, which we don't. And yet, we're expected to accept their deaths as absolute, unquestionable fact, even though there is no individual documentation proving they were even there in the first place. Let's pause on that. How is it that the most notorious mass murder in human history is not based on hard evidence, but on the absence of it? Imagine a murder trial with no names, no autopsies, no documents, no physical remains, just testimonies and confessions which were brought up from torture, and a lot of assumptions, as we will show later on. Would that hold up in court? Why is it that when it comes to Auschwitz, the normal rules of evidence don't seem to apply? The Nazis were obsessive record keepers, and yet somehow when it comes to the largest group of their victims, we have no records to even prove that this was going on. And we're expected to believe that these undocumented victims existed, even though there's no primary source proving that they were even there. They don't even have mass burning pits. We have individual ovens for each and every soul. That alone is a problem. The reason any facility would have individual ovens is for preserving individual ashes to send out to family, friends, and loved ones. There are no more than a dozen ovens in each crematorium. Another red flag for the 6 million narrative. To make up for this, Holocaust supporters tell us that they crammed the bodies in these individual ovens by the dozens. But even here, there are flaws. One of the crematoriums in Auschwitz that was supposedly used to cremate and dispose of bodies that were previously gas only contained 4 ovens. And each one, as you can see in this picture, can barely fit even 3 bodies, let alone dozens. The evolution of Auschwitz alone doesn't even fit with the narrative that they built this camp to exterminate. For an example, as said earlier in this video, Heinrich Himmler, who was Hitler's main guy, said that the crematoriums were only built to combat diseases and to get rid of bodies who had fallen from the disease. So the evolution of the crematoria themselves were literally there to help the prisoners and to prevent the diseases from spreading. They were originally and initially built for the prisoners' health.
Now, before we proceed any further, a little digression is needed about some genuine Holocaust revisionism. Dr. Franciszek Pieper is one of the Holocaust experts most directly responsible for the lowering of the Auschwitz death count. Along with other scholars like Israeli Holocaust expert Dr. Yehuda Bauer, it was decided around 1989 to admit publicly that fewer people died at Auschwitz than had previously been reported. In his book, Auschwitz, How Many Perished, Dr. Pieper concludes that the old Soviet-provided figure of 4 million is wrong, and that the real figure is closer to 1.1 million. Now that's no small revision, an admission that the Soviets exaggerated the figure by almost 4 times. We can also see how the fraudulent figure has been an ingrained part of supposedly factual Holocaust history for almost 50 years. As late as 1988, in the official Auschwitz State Museum guidebook, you'll find on page 19 an official affirmation of the 4 million figure. The Soviet State Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes stated that no less than 4 million people perished in Auschwitz. The Supreme National Tribunal in Poland stated that about 4 million persons perished in Auschwitz. According to the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, more than 4 million persons perished in Auschwitz. And these figures are based upon the evidence of hundreds of surviving prisoners and upon the opinion of experts. Well, this shows that not only was fraudulent Soviet evidence admitted as fact at Nuremberg, but also that survivors and experts can be wrong. And, if it matters, many Holocaust revisionists believe that the actual total of dead at Auschwitz is even less than 1.1 million.
The estimated number of people who died at Auschwitz has been revised over time and is now generally accepted by mainstream historians to be around 1.1 million. 6 million Jews being killed in the Holocaust is repeated in textbooks, memorials, even documentaries, even though we know this number is completely fraudulent. We know for a fact that the number wasn't based on precise records, due to the fact that it was already in circulation during the war, before the camps were fully liberated, before investigations were complete, and most importantly, before any testimony was given from any survivor, and long before access to key German records. And at the Nuremberg trials, this number was treated as unquestionable truth. People were tortured before being sentenced and executed, in parts on the basis of numbers that, decades later, were quietly revised downward by approximately 81.7%. And under these facts, we now disturbingly know that key Nazi figures were executed under fraudulent numbers and fraudulent testimony. Even after all of this, the 6 million number is treated as untouchable and unquestionable, even after it's been corrected by scholars and historians. In other words, people were being hunted down and executed for crimes measured by a number we now know was false. And that should disturb everyone.
Professor Robert Forisson of France's Lyon University told the court his research has convinced him the gas chambers and the Holocaust are historical lies. Forisson recalled a visit to Auschwitz when he ran his finger across the smokestack of a crematorium and found no soot. His investigation revealed that the crematorium was a reconstruction, not the original.
It was another day of startling testimony at the trial of Toronto publisher Ernst Zundel. The court heard from a professor of literature who spoke out in defense of Zundel. The scholar said the number of Jews who died in World War II is nowhere near what we've all been led to believe.
Dr. Robert Forisson disputes the widely held belief that 6 million Jews were killed during World War II. Said Forisson in court, it's impossible to sustain any more these fantastic figures. There is not even the slightest proof of even one gas chamber. Forisson testified he believed the casualty figures ranged between 200,000 and 350,000. He quoted his source for that estimate as the International Tracing Service, a group that tries to track down Jews who were displaced during the war.
Ditlev Felderer of Sweden compared himself to Voltaire, upholding the right of free speech. He said that in his 27 visits to Auschwitz in recent years, he found an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a banquet room, a sauna, even a dance hall where prisoners' orchestras played for inmates.
In a point-by-point cross-examination, Christie attempted to pick apart the testimony of one of the Crown's key witnesses as he questioned what the man saw during a 9-month stay at the Auschwitz concentration camp. On the stand for the second day, 56-year-old Arnold Friedman told the court how he watched columns of prisoners march toward the Auschwitz crematorium. Later, he watched smoke and flames pour from the building's smokestack. But under cross-examination, Friedman was forced to admit he had never witnessed mass executions. He only guessed at what happened. He agreed that the columns of prisoners could have been marching out of the camp through a gate next to the crematorium. Christie is out to prove that Zundel has reason to question the widely accepted beliefs about the Holocaust. He suggested to Friedman that many of the bodies burned at Auschwitz were those of Jews who died of disease and starvation.
This is Zundel's message. There were no gas chambers in Nazi concentration camps. There was no mass murder of European Jews. The Holocaust is a hoax, dreamed up after the Second World War by Zionists who wanted war reparation, money, to establish the State of Israel. In his house, Zundel keeps an elaborate scale model of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Ovens are included, but Zundel says they were used only to burn the bodies of typhus victims. Zundel denies he is anti-Semitic, but he is, to say the least, highly suspicious of many Jews.
Because some of them are diabolical liars, exploiters of their own people's suffering, real and imagined. They are manipulators, some of them.
And their power.
But because they have amassed an immense power, especially in the media, they have a terrible power to distort and a terrible power to create mischief.
Charges under a little-known criminal code, Section 177, were laid against Zundel by Auschwitz survivor and founder of the Canadian Holocaust Remembrance Association, Sabina Citron.
I'm innocent, as always. No, actually, I consider this just one more step in this struggle to have the Germans rehabilitated. I'm a German. I don't think that the Germans killed 6 million Jews.
Which leads me to the 6 million Jews dead phrase. This phrase was used over 246 times from 1865 to 1945. Not once was it true. In other words, for 80 decades, the phrase 6 million Jews dead has been used, and each and every single one of these cases have been proven false.
May the 7th, 1920. It's page 11 that I want. There we go. Page 11. Page 11. The article is called "The Jewish War Aid Gets $100,000 Gift." There it is. The Fund for Jewish War Sufferers in Central and Eastern Europe, where 6 millions face horrifying conditions of famine, disease and death, was enriched yesterday by a contribution of $100,000 from Nathan Strauss. Where 6 millions face horrifying conditions of famine, disease and death. 6 millions face horrifying conditions of famine, disease and death. I'll just go down the rest of the article if anybody wants to read it. There's an article called "Jewish War Aid Gets $100,000 Gift" in the New York Times, Friday, May the 7th, 1920. Here's the New York Times again. This is 1921. There you go. New York Times, Wednesday, July the 20th, 1921. It's page 2 that I want. There we go. Page 2. Page 2, New York Times, July 20th, 1921. And the article is called "Begs America, Save 6 Million in Russia. Massacre Threatens All Jews as Soviet Power Wanes, Declares Kreinin, Coming Here for Aid." Look at that. Russia's 6 million Jews are facing extermination by massacre. As the famine is spreading, the counter-revolutionary movement is gaining, and the Soviets' control is waning. Now this is one of the biggest articles of the lot. This is 1921, 12 years before Adolf Hitler ever set foot in the government. Look at that. Russia's 6 million Jews are facing extermination by massacre. As an article entitled "Begs America, Save 6 Million in Russia" on page 2 in the New York Times, Wednesday, July 20th, 1921. This is the Gazette of Montreal. This is 1931. The Gazette, Montreal, Tuesday, December the 29th, 1931. This is over a year before Hitler come to power. The Gazette, it's page 6 that I want. There we go. Page 6. Page 6. The Gazette, Montreal, December the 29th, 1931. And the article pretty much speaks up for itself. 6 million Jews face starvation. 6 million. Bad conditions in southeastern Europe reported by Rabbi Wise. Fears crisis at hand. 6 million Jews in Eastern Europe face starvation. and even worse during the coming winter. 6 million Jews. I'll give you a look at the rest of the article. The article is called 6 Million Jews Face Starvation. The Gazette of Montreal, December the 29th, 1931. 1.5 years before Adolf Hitler ever set foot in the government. This is the next newspaper. This is the New York Times again. There we go. New York Times. But this is dated 1936. Sunday, May the 31st, 1936. This does not say the 6 million Jews, but it does say Holocaust. New York Times. It's page 14 that I want. There we go. Page 14, the New York Times, May the 31st, 1936. And the article is called Americans Appeal for Jewish Refuge. It's quite a big article. But it's along here. Yeah. The petition, in expressing the opinion of enlightened Christian leadership in the United States favouring a larger Jewish immigration into Palestine, stressed the intolerable sufferings of the millions of Jews in the European Holocaust. The European Holocaust in 1936, before the Second World War even started. And you go up here, and there it is again. Great Britain has it within her power to throw open the gates of Palestine and let in the victimised and persecuted Jews escaping from the European Holocaust. The European Holocaust in 1936, 3.5 years before the Second World War ever even started. That's in an article entitled Americans Appeal for Jewish Refuge, the New York Times, May the 31st, 1936. Here's the next newspaper. This is New York Times again. New York Times. This is dated February the 23rd, 1938. This is before the Second World War started. About a year and a half. The New York Times. It's page 23 that I want. There you go. Page 23. The New York Times, February 23rd, 1938. And the article is called Jewish Teachers Chided by Isaacs. I'll go along the bottom. It is a Jewish tragedy pictured. A depressing picture of 6 million Jews in Central Europe deprived of protection or economical opportunities, slowly dying of starvation, all hope gone, was presented to the teachers by Jacob Tarshish. The Jewish tragedy started when Hitler came into power in 1933. There it is again, people. 6 million Jews in Central Europe, slowly dying of starvation. 6 million. This is in 1938. Jewish teachers charted by Isaacs. New York Times, February 23rd, 1938, a year and a half before the Second World War even started.
In a public record document in 1943, we have the head of British psychological warfare admitting that they made up the 6 million story in Public Record Office Document FO 371/34551, dated August 27, 1943. Victor Cavendish Bentinck admitted that there was not in the slightest evidence that gas chambers existed and that such tales of their alleged existence were employed solely for propaganda purposes. In a handwritten minute, he admitted and wrote, "We have had a good run for our money with this gas chamber story we have been putting about, but don't we run the risk? Eventually we are going to be found out, and when we are found out, the collapse of that lie is going to bring the whole of our psychological warfare with it. So isn't it rather time now to let it drift off by itself and concentrate on the other lines that we are running?" In this document, the British Psychological Warfare Department has admitted that they made up the stories of the gas chambers and the Holocaust solely for the purposes of propaganda. In other words, British specialists in the Psychological Warfare Department has admitted that they lied about the whole thing.
Ernst Zundel portrayed himself today as a man fighting for the good name of Germans, and part of that fight is the denial of the Holocaust. Zundel came to Canada in 1958. He said he found Germans slandered in print and on television. "We were cowards, criminals, romantic dreamers, butchers, and Colonel Klinks, the butt end of every joke, and I didn't like it." He told the court that the Holocaust was at the center of the anti-German bias. Until 1960, he believed that 6 million Jews had been killed. Then, after reading widely and interviewing authors around the world, he changed his mind. Referring to some of the Holocaust atrocity stories, Zundel said, "Only someone mesmerized by propaganda could believe in such nonsense." Zundel testified that the high death toll at camps like Dachau was mostly due to typhus, and those epidemics came late in the war. There were no active gas chambers for humans, he said. The jury in the trial has seen this military film alleging that a shower at Dachau was used to gas Jews with Zyklon B gas. Zundel said that most authorities, including officials at Dachau today, now say that the gas chamber was never used. It took 20 years, he said, to admit that Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen did not have gas chambers, he said. In time, the world would have to admit that Auschwitz and other eastern camps also did not use gas for human extermination. Zundel also said that the post-war Nuremberg trials were Germany's darkest hour, an example of human debasement. Through his lawyer, Doug Christie, Zundel introduced the writings of American politicians and jurists of the 1940s who criticized the trials as a blot on American justice.
Zundel said the Holocaust is like a rumor that grows wilder each time it's repeated through each generation. He said it served well as war propaganda, but 40 years later, it is time to put that propaganda aside.
Zundel told the jury that we must now realize that every government manipulates information and has censorship in times of war, and that we owe it to ourselves to be informed of the truth, or we will be mental slaves even after the war is over.
A recognized expert on the Holocaust today admitted there is no single report that shows the existence of gas chambers in Nazi concentration camps. Dr. Raoul Hilberg was testifying for the third day at the trial of Ernst Zundel.
Was there a report that anyone was gassed? Hilberg, there's no single report about gas chambers. I can't swear there's correspondence to prove it.
Officials from the International Red Cross visited the camps regularly and had complete access to the camps, documented everything, and estimated the total dead from all the camps to be around 271,000 to 290,000. About half of these dead were Jewish. So we are now talking about some 150 to 200,000 Jews that died in the German camps, primarily of disease. In the 1,650-page Red Cross report, there was never a mention of any gas chambers. There basically were 4 categories interned during the war: Poles, Jews, Russians, and political prisoners, sometimes alluded to as Germans. Jews made up less than 40% of Auschwitz, only around 12% of Dachau, and only around 30% of Buchenwald.
You've got, for example, the death books of Auschwitz, which are the most reliable source. The Soviets confiscated all the information about lives and death of people living in Auschwitz when they liberated the camp, and those were finally published in the 1990s, and those give you a total, 29,000 Jews die in Auschwitz throughout the World War II, okay? And you've got somewhat more Catholics die. You've got more Catholics than Jews dying in Auschwitz. And if you want to say, oh, there's some missing data there, some Jews not registered who died, and so on, well, you can put it up at very most, I would say, 40,000 Jews dying at Auschwitz. Now, I don't allow it to go any higher than that. And that is 100 times less than the 4 million plaque at Birkenau after the war. Soviets put that totally absurd figure.
Number of dead at Auschwitz was revised in 1989 from 4.1 million down to 1 million. Upon capture by the Soviet Union, original propaganda also claimed that 2 million were murdered in Majdanek, which included 7 homicidal gas chambers. 5 of these 7 have been admitted to never even have served as homicidal gas chambers. Number of dead at Majdanek was revised in 2005 from 2 million to 78,000. But somehow, the official account of 6 million dead remained unchanged. So, what is 6 million minus 4 million minus 2 million? The Holocaust is the only claimed genocide where millions can be reduced from the total claim to be killed, but the total figure always remains 6 million. Several sources, including the World Almanac, Red Cross documentation, the New York Times, and the Chambers Encyclopedia, shows that the Jewish population recorded does not reflect the testimonials given on the Holocaust. The Jewish World Almanac has been regarded as the absolute most authentic and trustworthy source for the world's Jewish population numbers. And according to the World Almanac, the world population of Jews increased between 1933 and 1948 from 15,315,000 to 15,753,000.
One of the most well-known atrocity claims that the Jews were turned as soap by the Nazis in World War II was circulated by a man named Stephen Wise, long before the war had ended, without any evidence. Stephen Wise was a powerful American rabbi and Zionist leader during the Second World War. He became one of the loudest voices calling attention to the horrors taking place in Europe. But several of his claims were blatant lies and pushed without evidence. In fact, in 1942, Stephen Wise publicly recorded that Jews were being made into soap, a claim that has since been widely discredited by historians as unproven. Yet, these reports of his helped fuel outrage and moral justification for U.S. intervention in the ongoing war. But this wasn't the first time Wise has made bold claims. Back in 1931, a full 10 years before the Holocaust even began, Stephen Wise told the public that 6 million Jews in Eastern Europe were in danger of starvation and extermination. That's right, 6 million, the exact number that would later become permanently etched into the world's memory after the war. But during World War II, as propaganda of Nazis' brutality began to circulate, Wise's reports were filled with disturbing stories, even though they were unverified. These stories later helped stir American public opinion and justified military engagement on the Western Front. But what's most disturbing, all of these claims and reports turned out to be exaggerated or completely false. The soap rumor, the shrunken heads, the human skin lampshades, they were widely believed at the time, but in the decades since, many of them have been quietly walked back or dismissed by scholars.
During the 20th century, there were various alleged instances of soap being made from human body fat. Notably during World War I, the British press claimed the Germans operate a so-called corpse factory, where they allegedly made soap from the bodies of their soldiers. This story, though false, was widely circulated as propaganda during the war. Then, during and after World War II, the same type of claim resurfaced, only this time it was said that the Nazis were mass-producing soap from the bodies of victims in concentration camps located in German-occupied Poland. The fact that nearly the exact same story was recycled from one world war to the next raises serious questions. The pattern of repeating wartime propaganda, until it became accepted as truth, played as a major role in spreading and cementing the soap myth. At the Nuremberg trials, items were even presented as evidence of such production. And after the war, the soap-making rumor was widely accepted and published as fact in numerous books, newspaper articles, and museums. However, the claim has been debunked for decades. Historians have repeatedly clarified, quote, "It is a fact that the Nazis never used the bodies of Jews, or that matter anyone else, for the production of soap. The soap rumor was thoroughly investigated after the war and proved to be untrue," end quote. Despite this, many continue to believe the myth, aware that they are repeating a recycled lie.
On January 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin. This meeting, later called the Wannsee Conference, is often cited as the point where the Nazis coordinated the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. Documents produced from that meeting is known as the Wannsee Protocol. It outlines discussions about the Jewish populations across Europe, their classifications, and plans for their evacuation to the east. However, despite its reputation, the document does not contain any explicit reference to mass extermination. Nowhere in the document does it mention gas chambers, crematoria, or direct killing methods. However, terms like evacuation, resettlement, and processing can be found. One key paragraph says, and I quote, "In the course of the final solution and under appropriate direction, the Jews are to be utilized for work in the East in a suitable manner in large labor columns and separated by sexes. Jews capable of working will be dispatched to these regions to build roads, and in the process a large number of them will undoubtedly drop out by the way of natural reduction." Notice how it says reduce naturally. Even the word extermination in German is absent, and what is present instead is a logistical overview, population numbers, categories of Jews, and which government agencies would be involved in their evacuation. If this document was the official plan for mass genocide, it's definitely lacking key information to come up with such conclusions. It reads more like a coordination of forced deportations and labor, not a detailed plan for mass murder. The Wannsee Protocol has been described as a deadly turning point, yet its own contents deny such narratives. It only shows that the Nazi leadership was deeply involved with mass deportations and even labor camps, until their removal of other lands which they listed, but it does not confirm in its own words that mass extermination was formally declared that day.
Evidence would be sought in considering how the Allies behaved at the time, how the Red Cross behaved at the time, how the Vatican behaved at the time, how the German opposition to Hitler behaved at the time, the behavior of the Jewish organizations at that time, the vast numbers of Jews in Europe at the end of the war, bound for Palestine and the USA and other destinations. The contemporaneous German documents, of course, the aerial photos, the lack of physical evidence for extermination, the lack of evidence for engineering design projects to create equipment for the extermination of large numbers of human beings in gas chambers.
We are told that the Germans had a policy of exterminating the Jews physically, and that for this policy they used as a special weapon the gas chambers, especially with Zyklon B. And we are told that the total of the Jewish victims were 6 million. We think that the Jews, of course, were persecuted, that there were concentration camps, deportations, and so on, and that the final solution of the Jewish question for the Germans was the immigration, if possible, of the Jews, and if necessary, the deportation, but certainly not the extermination. And we are not people who deny whatsoever. We affirm after many, many researches that there were no order from Hitler or from anyone to exterminate the Jews, no plan, no budget, and that the specific weapon of the specific crime did not exist. I mean the famous Nazi gas chamber.
The established account of World War II presents significant gaps in unresolved issues. No definitive order from German authorities for systematic extermination has ever been recovered. Throughout the war, Allied leadership made no direct reference to an ongoing program of mass killings, Even after the Germans' withdrawal from Rome, the Vatican remained publicly silent on the matter. A critical examination of the claims made during and after the war reveals serious problems. Stories such as soap from corpses are not supported by credible evidence. Despite this, claims alike were widely accepted and was used as fraudulent evidence during the Nuremberg trials and repeated as fact for decades. Allegations concerning the mistreatment of American and British prisoners of war also lack consistent documentation. In contrast, actions carried out by the Western Allies, including strategic bombing, civilian expulsion, post-war detention camps, are rarely subjected to the same level of scrutiny.
Several trials were taking place. Among these were the trials held at the Dachau camp outside Munich, and thus not far from Nuremberg, of the staffs of some concentration camps that had been captured by the Americans, and of those accused of killing 83 American prisoners at Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge. These trials were supervised by the War Crimes Branch. They were perhaps the most shameful episodes in U.S. history. The entire repertoire of third-degree methods was enacted at Dachau, beatings and brutal kicking to the point of ruining testicles in 137 cases, knocking out teeth, starvation, solitary confinement, torture with burning splinters, and impersonation of priests in order to encourage prisoners to confess. Low-rank prisoners were assured that convictions were being sought only against higher-ranking officers, and that they had absolutely nothing to lose by cooperating and making the desired statement. Such evidence was then used against them when they joined their superiors in the dock. The latter, on the other hand, had been told that by confessing, they had taken all responsibility onto themselves, thereby shielding their men from trial. A favorite stratagem when a prisoner refused to cooperate was to arrange a mock trial. The prisoner was led into a room in which civilian investigators dressed in U.S. Army uniforms were seated around a black table with a crucifix in the center with 2 candles providing the only light. This court then proceeded to hold a sham trial, at the conclusion of which a sham death sentence was passed. The condemned prisoner was later promised that, if he cooperated with the prosecutors in giving evidence, he would be reprieved. Sometimes, interrogators threatened to turn prisoners over to the Russians. In many cases, the prisoner's family was threatened with loss of ration cards or other hardships if cooperation was not obtained. As distinct from the mock trials, the official trials were also an apparently deliberate mockery of any conception of due process. The mockery started with the indictment, which made only general reference to very broad categories of crimes allegedly committed in the years from 1942 to 1945. In the cases of concentration camp personnel, and then proceeded to present a long list of defendants accused of being criminal in the extremely general sense stated. Specific crimes by specific people on specific dates were not part of the indictments. In some cases, the defense counsel was an American with no legal training who could not speak German. Competent interpreters were not provided at the trial. The prosecution also lacked legal training, as did the court.
The U.S. Army authorities in charge admitted some of these things. When the chief of the Dachau War Crimes Branch, Colonel Rosenfeld, quit his post in 1948, he was asked by newspapermen if there was any truth behind the stories about the mock trials, at which sham death sentences were passed. He replied, "Yes, of course. We couldn't have made those birds talk otherwise. It was a trick, and it worked like a charm." Several books dealing with Holocaust revisionism and Wikipedia itself makes notice of one notable incident when investigator Joseph Kirschbaum brought a certain Einstein into court to testify that the accused Manzel had murdered Einstein's brother. When the accused Manzel was able to point out that the brother was alive and well, and in fact sitting in the court, Kirschbaum, the investigator, was deeply embarrassed and scolded poor Einstein, saying, "How can we bring this pig to the gallows if you're so stupid to bring your brother into court?" Though comedic, such a documentation of events shows just how fraudulent some of these claims that are being brought up from witnesses truly are. The unreasonable continuation of war crimes trials in West Germany and the absence of any statute of limitations with respect to the alleged war crimes by Germans had remarked implications. People who were there had been afraid to come forward and report to what their knowledge actually happened. They would rather not call attention to the fact that they were there. However, it was inevitable that a few courageous individuals would would come forward. Nevertheless, the most important of these to date has been Thies Christofferson, the author of the booklet Die Auschwitz Lüge, which means the Auschwitz Lie. Christofferson was at Auschwitz from January to December in 1944. In 1973, he published his recollections and his firm view that no exterminations ever took place there. An English translation of Christofferson's booklet was published in 1974, and anybody could do a quick Google search and look at the continuity within his booklet. Ginsburg wrote many books, though they are not particularly well researched, since his views are based mainly on what he read in the newspapers, plus his personal experiences as a Jew who, together with his family, was deported during the war to occupied Eastern Territory by the Nazis and the Romanians. After the war, Ginsburg took his family to Israel, but he eventually became very anti-Zionist and moved back to Europe. Eventually, he set up a bookbindery in Munich. While he believes that many Jews perished as a result of the combined effects of Nazi policies and wartime conditions, he denies that the German government ever contemplated the extermination of the Jews of Europe, and he is particularly scornful of the 6 million figure. He is unsure of the existence of gas chambers, but he believes that many Jews perished on the account of epidemics, and he offers an estimate about 3 million as the maximum possible number of victims, although he believes the correct figure is much lower. As a reward for his efforts to get at the truth, Ginsburg, a small man and not young, was beaten up by Jewish thugs while visiting his wife's grave at an Israeli cemetery in Munich. There are documents dealing with concentration camp administration, with crematory instructions, and with deportations. There are also operations which employed prison labor. On the contrast, there is of course no direct documentary evidence of an extermination program. As Dr. Kubavi, the Center for the Jewish Documentation in Tel Aviv, admitted in 1960s that there are no documents signed by Hitler, Himmler, or Heydrich speaking on the matter of exterminating the Jews, and the word extermination does not appear in the letter from Groening to Heydrich concerning the final solution of the Jewish question. Dr. Wilhelm Steglitz, a retired Hamburg judge who had been assigned to an anti-aircraft unit near Auschwitz during 1944 and had visited the camp Auschwitz on few occasions. For such honest reportings of his recollections there, Steglitz was punished with a 5-year, 20% reduction rate on his pension. Jewish historian Samuel Gringos, who was himself interned in the ghetto of Krenas in Lithuania, during the war criticized what he called the hyper-historical nature of most Jewish survivor testimony. He wrote that most of the memoirs and reports are full of perpetuous verbosity, graphomanic exaggeration, dramatic effects, overestimated self-inflation, dilettante philosophizing, would-be lyricism, unchecked rumors, bias, partisan attacks, and apologies. And that has to be one of the harshest critiques on the Holocaust that I have seen from a Jew.
You take people to a concentration camp and show us a door that opens from the inside?
Well, now, wait a minute. I want to first say that my studies are based on my own examination into the physical evidence. The gas chambers, the buildings claimed to be the gas chambers, still exist at 2 of the camps in Poland. You can go there, you can conduct forensic tests, or you can go there and just look for yourself. Now, one of the gas chambers at the Majdanek camp...
We'll show you. Show them the film. This is a film that Mr. Cole would be happy to show you and has shown a number of people.
Most importantly, the Zyklon B gas that is said to have been used leaves blue stains and traces on the walls. These are the delousing chambers at Birkenau, at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. They are loaded with blue staining that indicates Zyklon B gas usage. Here I am in the inside of the delousing chamber. The blue staining is clear. The traces are measurable even 50 years after the fact. But now we come to the inside of a gas chamber, a supposedly murderous gas chamber at the Mauthausen camp in Austria. There is no blue staining on the walls, no Zyklon B traces in the walls. They have been measured. There is no Zyklon B residue. 50 years after the fact, it exists at the delousing chambers. It does not exist in the supposedly homicidal gas chambers. Here we see the door to the Mauthausen gas chamber. It does not lock. It doesn't lock. The latches can be opened from the inside or the outside, as I am showing right here. You cannot lock somebody into this room. You cannot lock somebody out of this room. This is physical evidence. It has nothing to do with what I'm assuming or what I'm guessing about. Then I show a door to one of the gas chambers at the Majdanek camp in Poland. Same thing. The door Should be coming up. Here we go. The door latches only from the inside. Here I am. I'm standing inside the gas chamber, and I'm showing the latches from the inside. Now, this door opens into the chamber. If you're going to pack 1,000 people in a room and kill them, you can't have a door that then opens into the room, because they will be piled up against the door where they died. And I am now showing that the latches of this door, they latch inside. You cannot lock somebody into this room.
Okay. I told Mr. Zundel and his defense team prior to my going that if I did in fact find facilities that could have supported executions, not only whether they did support the executions, but only whether or not they could have sustained gas executions, I would make that very clear in my report, and that is what I would testify to when I testified in court. With the exception of the video photographer, I brought the same things that I would have normally brought to a prison in the United States if I was doing a survey of their equipment. The draftsman was there to take and verify measurements. The drawings were made on site and then reproduced when we returned to the United States to document everything we saw. I personally made photographs and produced a great deal of photographic evidence of the hardware and facilities that we found in Poland. And the video photographer, which was not a normal thing for me, was brought to document the fact that the forensic samples that I removed from the facilities, the control sample from delousing facility number 1 of Birkenau, and all of the other samples from the alleged gas execution rooms were properly taken, packaged for submission to the laboratories. I examined the facilities, and I made a determination that they were incapable of supporting the use of hydrogen cyanide gas for purposes of execution or otherwise. But additionally, it would be necessary to remove samples, return them to the United States for testing at an independent laboratory to in fact confirm what my visual inspection indicated, that these facilities never in fact contained hydrogen cyanide gas.
What, aside from the samples, convinced you that these facilities could not have been used then or now as execution facilities?
The samples in my mind were mainly corroborative. The reasons that I determined that these facilities were not or never could have been gas execution facilities are stated in my report. And it mainly is concerned with the design and fabrication of these facilities. The requirements necessary in the design of a facility that contains a highly explosive and highly poisonous gas. You must have gasketed doors, no windows, means of getting the gas in, means of getting the gas out, something for heating the gas and the air to constantly keep the right temperature, explosion-proof switches, lighting facilities, etc. None of these ever existed. We're talking about brick and mortar buildings without heat, with non-explosion proof lighting, without gasketed doors, in some cases without doors at all, and with crematories that opened very close or adjacent to the facility. If these facilities were used for gas execution facilities, if those persons operating the facilities didn't gas themselves to death at the same time that the executees died, they certainly would have been blown to bits when the gas exploded from a spark arc in a switch, the heat of a light bulb, or the gas approaching and getting into the crematory furnace. I mean, it's just ludicrous to consider that these facilities could have been used as gas chambers.
Well, we all know from reading the newspapers and watching TV that there's many Holocaust survivors who say that they actually saw gassings. They described them in minute detail, which relative it was they lost, down to the color of the corpses and the color of the smoke coming out of the chimney. How do you respond to these people?
Well, one of the things that was necessary for me to do, Kirk, at the outset, so I'd have an understanding of what I was doing, was read the literature and alleged eyewitness reports, so I could make a determination of the protocol, which that's a fancy word that we use in terms of executions for determining for what the actual procedure is for the execution. And I found through these investigations that there is no such a thing as an eyewitness. I have never seen a report that was written by anyone who had a valid description of what could have happened at a gassing. So the long and the short of it is, there are no eyewitnesses because there were no gassings.
The Red Cross kept detailed records of all the deaths in the concentration camps. They recorded to be around 271,000. The Allies broke the codes to the SS communications and never heard anything about a Holocaust. There is no order from Hitler for a final solution in the way people think. American executive expert Fred Lucher scraped the bricks at Auschwitz at the gas chambers and found no Zyklon B residue. Paul Rasseneur, a French communist, was in a concentration camp alongside Jews, and he wrote about his experience being completely different. Also, it's important to point out that those death numbers mentioned before from the Red Cross are not 100% Jewish deaths. They reported that at Auschwitz, 55.4% of the deaths were Christians, mostly from Poland, and 42.8% were Jews. In West Germany, the Red Cross said the total deaths at Auschwitz was around 52,000. A document posted by the Red Cross on November 22nd of 1944 says, "The Red Cross had succeeded in visiting the camp at Auschwitz. We were able to supply you with the following information. It is a fact that one of our delegations was able to enter this camp. According to his impression, the camp was a type of extensive concentration camp where the detainees were compelled to various kinds of work, including work outside the camp. Our delegate told us that he had not been able to discover any trace of installations for exterminating civilian prisoners. This fact corroborates a report which we had already received from other sources, that for several months past there had been no further exterminations at Auschwitz. At all events, this is not a camp containing exclusively Jews." So the Red Cross even admits that they found no installations in the camp for extermination.
Supports revisionist observations such as nobody acted as if it was happening, or at the end of the war the Jews were still there, or the German documents speak of a program of expulsion and resettlement, or catastrophic death scenes in 1945 were fraudulently represented as evidence of intentional extermination. So those are observations that a revisionist can make and direct you to piles and piles of books that show precisely these things. On their site, see, the statements that they can make on their site seem to me that all of these categories, leading Nazis said, all historians say, survivors say, Hus confessed that, this inmate testified that. I think on their side it's all what somebody said.
Now, at the end of the Second World War, the Allies confiscated a tremendous quantity of German documents dealing with Germany's wartime Jewish policy, which was sometimes referred to as the so-called final solution. But not a single German document has been found that orders or even refers to an extermination program. To the contrary, the documents clearly show that the German final solution policy was one of emigration and deportation, not extermination. There's a lot I could say in this regard, but time does not permit getting into some of that. Holocaust historians, ladies and gentlemen, rely very heavily on so-called survivor testimony to support the extermination story. But such evidence is notoriously unreliable. One Jewish historian, a man named Samuel Gringaus, who is himself a survivor, pointed out in an article in the January 1950 issue of the quarterly journal Jewish Social Studies that, quote, most of the memoirs and reports of survivors are full of preposterous verbosity, graphomanic exaggeration, dramatic effects, overestimated self-inflation, dilettante philosophizing, would-be lyricism, unchecked rumors, bias, partisan attacks, and apologies, unquote. In addition, more than 10,000 of the 20,000 so-called testimonies of Jewish survivors on file at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Center in Israel are also unreliable, according to a front-page article that appeared in the Jerusalem Post newspaper of August 17, 1986. The report quotes Shmuel Kokovsky, the archives director of the Israeli government's Holocaust Memorial Center, who declared that, quote, over half of the 20,000 testimonies from Holocaust survivors on record at Yad Vashem are unreliable, unquote.
They have basic problems, the historians on the other side, you see. They have problems like the fact that the entire Goebbels diary is 80,000 pages of handwriting and typescript, which I have now read from start to finish. There is not a single mention of gas chambers or of people going to gas chambers. The diaries also prove to my mind, and I'm satisfied that as Hitler's biographer I've read the lines of those diaries correctly and interpreted them correctly, that Hitler had almost no part to play in this. Hitler was an unwilling spectator while Goebbels started this whole operation off. But I emphasize, whatever it was that happened to the Jews, in the entire diaries there's no reference to gas chambers. There's no reference to factories of death. There's no reference to what we now call the Holocaust.
Not only Auschwitz, they liberated all the camps in Poland, and that is really not known. And something I wanted to point out to you, you know, there are many pictures about the Russian liberating Auschwitz, and there's never any snow, and the snow was honestly that high. And so I have some connection with the Russian embassy, and I was there once, and I said, something puzzles me. Those photos are fakes, because there's no snow. And they said, well, yes, they are not fakes, but when the army came, they didn't have cameras, they didn't photograph. So only much later, when they realized we should have pictures of it, they took pictures like you see now, but this is definitely not in Auschwitz and not the liberation of Auschwitz. There were not that many people with clothes and children, and no snow.
Right, fascinating.
But it got even more ridiculous. While Elon was at Auschwitz, they rolled out a big movie screen to play footage from the concentration camp. Do you know what the problem with that is? It's fake. It's footage that we have been shown for decades from Auschwitz, and it was filmed after World War II by the Soviets. It was propaganda by definition. And that's not the only thing fake about that place. The gas chambers, the crematoriums, so often discussed, they were destroyed at the end of World War II, if they were ever there in the first place. And they were reconstructed later for demonstration purposes by guess who? The Soviets. And you know what the icing on the cake of all of this is? For decades, we were told that over 4 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. We were told that they were gassed and tossed into ovens like an assembly line from hell. This number was recorded in history books. It was repeated on television. It was even etched into stone in 19 different languages at the site of the former camp itself. Anyone who questioned it was called an anti-Semite. And it's not just an anti-Semite, but an anti-Semite of the worst order, if you question that. But in the early 90s, it was admitted that less than half of those previously claimed had died at Auschwitz. As the Chicago Tribune reported in a 1992 article called, quote, "Fixing the Numbers at Auschwitz." Gone now from the memorials are the 19 inscriptions that said in 19 languages that 4 million people died here. The memorials are blank because they were wrong. Jewish and Polish scholars of the Holocaust now agree that the Auschwitz death toll was less than half the 4 million cited here for 4 decades. The actual number was probably between 1.1 million and 1.5 million, the report said. So how did this information come to light in the early 1990s? Well, could it be that the Soviet Union, a communist country that was established and dominated by Jews, had recently collapsed? Or were the Soviets propping up an ultra-Jewish victimhood narrative around World War II for their own benefit, or for the benefit of Israel? The benefit of the Jewish people as a whole? It seems pretty obvious. And this really does beg the question. We have to ask, has the overall 6 million Holocaust deaths figure been adjusted to reflect the Auschwitz revelations? Now, that's not to say that prisoners weren't being held there, and that bad things didn't happen. It was a war. It was a world war. Of course bad things, horrific things happened on all fronts.
Doing the work in the British archives that the other historians have not done, Paul Norris has turned up the evidence that our own psychological warfare executive were behind the entire gas chamber story. And once again, we're quoting from the archives. They're in the British archives, how the psychological warfare executive decides quite cold-bloodedly and cynically to start putting out over the radio waves the allegation that the Germans have built special gas chambers for gassing the Jews and getting rid of them. And later on in the files, around about 1944, you find the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, who is responsible for the psychological warfare executive, writing a handwritten minute. His name is Victor Cavendish Bentinck, an eminent banker, an industrialist, still alive in England now, Lord Portland as he is now, chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, writing and handwriting in 1944, words to the following effect. We've had a good run for our money with this gas chamber lie, but really we've got to be a bit careful because eventually it's going to be exposed and then our entire psychological warfare effort will be brought down with it. So isn't it a good time now to distance ourselves from this particular story? We've set the hair running, now we ought to let it go off by itself. A good run for their money in 1944, and here we are in 1988, and that hair is still running 44 years later.
The Holocaust, why it's important, it's not just that it didn't happen, but it's, again, every accusation is a confession. They say Hitler started this war. That's a lie. It's the Jews declared war in 1933 and were seeking it by every possible means. Not that they're ready to fight, but they want every other nation to fight for them against Germany. They say that Hitler wanted to take over Europe. No, it's the Jews that want to take over Europe and indeed the world in fulfillment with the Antichrist plans. They say Hitler was genocidal. No, it's the Jews who had plans during and then after the war to commit a genocide against the Germans, trying to poison 6 million Germans in revenge for what didn't even happen. And then the Morgenthau plan, that this attempt, 7 to 8, 9 million Germans were killed after the war through starvation and persecution. The starvation that happened in the prison camps, so you see these videos of emaciated corpses at the end of the war. That was not caused by the German policy of how they ran their prisons throughout the whole war. It was caused by the Allied carpet bombing, which destroyed German infrastructure, so you could hardly get food to citizens, never mind to the prisoners, and that's why they succumbed to dysentery and became so emaciated, and so many of them died.
Ursula Haverbeck, who simply speaks the truth about what she experienced in that time and how they were all starving and there were no jobs. She's in prison right now in Germany.
Who you're talking about? She's like 95 years old, correct?
Yes.
And people that weren't born in the time put her in jail because she says she says what she saw is not what they claimed they read. Could you imagine putting someone in jail for history they say you lived when you weren't born yet? How absurd is that? I don't think you could even defend yourself in these Holocaust cases. You can't even bring a defense, I read. No. I'm not 100% sure if that's true, but you can't even defend yourself. So just basically throw a 95-year-old and grandma is in prison because she said she was at the camps and it didn't happen.